it is crime scene conduct for first responders. Now, as a first responder, and keeping in mind, I think Jacques would have shared with you last week things like the powers of EMI and the mandate thereof. A first responder is normally somebody who arrives on the scene or the site first. You can arrive on the scene first for various reasons. You might have stumbled upon the scene accidentally. In our environment here, a field ranger may be on patrol, and tracks that he's following may lead him to a scene, or vultures can be an indicator. We also sometimes, when we fly around doing whatever work in a fixed wing or a helicopter, one would find the scene there, and then somebody needs to stop there and have a look what's going on. Or you may be requested to react on a report. Somebody might have seen something. To give you a very quick example, a while ago, somewhere around Gauteng, people reported to the authorities a bad odor which came from a specific house or a small holding, and the authorities had to attend to that. And you may be the first person arriving in reacting to that report. And then, of course, it must be a suspected crime scene. In other words, if it's not a crime scene, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later, then you will not be the first responder for that matter. And then normally, you will not have a mandate to investigate beyond that initial investigation. In other words, if you are not appointed as a law enforcement officer in terms of the National Environmental Management Act, you will not have a mandate to investigate beyond certain steps. All right, now your initial responsibilities should first and foremost, and I think if you forget everything else that I'm saying here to you this morning, then the word integrity or preserve the integrity of the scene, if only that sticks to you, then we've gained a lot. It is probably the most important thing for you to remember and keep in mind throughout the period that you spend time on a scene like that, is to preserve the integrity of that scene. Now, what would preserve mean, or the integrity of the scene? You are not allowed to change anything. You're not allowed to tamper with any evidence. You must, in other words, keep that scene in its original state. And in order to get there, the first step you should do is to secure the scene and the evidence. Now, secure can be anything from placing guards around it or screening it off with barrier tape. I know one, do not carry barrier tape in your back pocket all the time, but securing the scene in whatever practical way you can should be your very first step. And of course, any evidence that you may find there. As I've said already, to preserve the integrity of the scene, in other words, to keep it in its original state. Preserving the integrity of the scene also then helps you a lot with the chain of custody of any evidence that should follow after that, regardless whether you have a mandate to gather any evidence on the scene or not. But the preserve of the integrity of the scene should be the first and foremost thing on your mind. And then, of course, to conduct initial documentation on the scene. There's a saying that if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. And also the reason why you need to make notes on the scene is you cannot remember everything. You may, in a day or two, be asked by the police or somebody to supply a statement or a report. And if you didn't make notes, it's going to be difficult for you to remember whatever you saw there. And then the very next step is, of course, to report everything immediately. Now, you can report it via radio, or cell phone, doesn't matter, as long as the report gets to a supervisor or somebody who can then take it forward. Is a safe environment. Now, arriving on a scene, and I'm going to highlight all of these at once here, is the fourth thing: stop, look, listen, and smell. Stop right where you are. You never know what the perimeters of a scene may be that you stumble upon. You may already be within an area where the perimeters are behind you. In other words, that you may already be in a scene, you might have already passed any evidence. So look where you are, have a good look around and absorb the environment. Look for animal and human indicators. You never know what else apart from maybe a carcass is on the scene that's still around. To give you an example, I crept up to a rhino carcass once, which we had to process, and arriving close to this carcass, about 2 or 3 meters from it, suddenly on the other side, a lioness stuck her head out, and we had a very brief encounter. Luckily, both of us had a big fright and we ran away in different directions, but you never know what else is still on the scene, as well as human on the scene. A suspect may still be around on the scene. So it's very important to look around and see what is going on. Listen for unusual sounds or absence of sounds. Again, if I had stopped and listened when I approached that lion carcass, that rhino carcass, I would have heard the lion chewing on bones, which I didn't do. So you need to stop and listen for unusual sounds or the absence of it. Sometimes it is very quiet, which may be an indicator of things. And then smell. Take a deep breath, smell for any human or any unnatural smells. Of course, if it's a rotten carcass, it will be difficult to smell anything else but the rotten carcass. But you need to spend a little bit of time on that as well. Be aware of risks to your personal safety. I mentioned that suspects may be on the scene. We had an incident, to give another example, of where we were processing a fairly large poaching scene where 2 rhino were shot, and we didn't realize that the poachers were in the area and they were actually watching it. We only realized that afterwards when some information came from communities outside that they were actually watching us there. So be aware of people that can be on the scene, potential poachers or other people who are a bit curious. Dangerous or injured animals may also be present. For instance, along the Sabi River here by us, people set snares, and they don't set only 1 or 2 snares. They will set 10 to 50 snares, and you may stumble upon a dead animal in the snare, but there may be something else also injured, which may be a risk to you. Now, something about initial documentation. Of course, you need to write at the top your name, your surname, and your affiliation. Your affiliation is important. And also, always remember that your original notes made on the scene, when it was still fresh in your mind, is admissible in court for you to refresh your memory with. So much more important that you make notes on the scene and that you take notes of everything that you see. So start with your name, surname, and affiliation. Very important. Anybody else who's present, who's with you there, because remember, everybody on that scene in the end will probably have to supply a statement or a report to the police if this should go into a proper police investigation. The date and time. The time is very important. One always remember to write down the date, but myself also made the mistake before not to write down the date. And then you always have to ask somebody, if somebody else was present, what time did we arrive there? Or you have to go back to your photographs. But time, very important. Time can also be important to backtrack your investigation on what you think might have happened there. The GPS position or location of the scene is very important. If you do not have a GPS with you, if your cell phone doesn't have the ability, then a detailed description of the location is very, very important, because somebody needs to go where you are now to come and support you maybe. And if they don't know where to go, then you are going to waste very precious time. Then photograph the scene. We always call it the initial photograph of an undisturbed scene, where you just take one photograph of the scene as you found it. Remember, at this stage, you're not at a stage where you're going to photograph exhibits. You just need to take a photograph of your undisturbed scene. And you must make a note of the suspected offense. Whatever you suspected there, what you suspect happened there, is just make a note of that. And the species involved as well. Sometimes it's not possible to identify the species because the scene may be a couple of days old. So if you cannot identify the species, then don't take a chance and guess, because maybe later on, if your guess was incorrect, it may come back and bite you in court or when you have to supply a statement. And then any other observations. I always say rather write too much than too little. So anything else that you do observe or what you think may be of importance, write that down, and you can chew about on it a little bit later. And also to whom you've reported your findings. If you made a telephone call or a radio call, if you do make a radio call, it's important, if you cannot recognize the voice of the person on the other side, is to just ask him or her a name and surname, and then you note that down as well. Now, this is just an example of notes on the scene, initial notes. You can see we started up there top with date and time, who was present, the location. If you do not have a GPS, give a good description, or as accurate a description as you can, so that it can take somebody to where you are or take somebody back to that scene if you are not present. The scene, describe the scene as good as you can. I wrote the impala caught and killed on the northern side of the river. A wire snare around the neck of the impala, 2 shoe imprints are visible, and 1 Aquila water bottle near the carcass. So you see I made notes there of whatever I could initially see. It may happen that later on you see other things, and there's nothing prohibiting you of making more notes. If you cannot add onto this page, for instance, then just use a different page. And then very important is a sketch plan, a very rough sketch plan. You can see that this sketch plan has been made in a couple of minutes. It is definitely not made by an artist, and you don't need to be an artist to do a rough sketch plan. But also write as much as you can there, and write a description of what you saw, like the shoe prints there. Wherever you saw them, you can draw them, but write next to it what it is, because you may just make figures there, but when you get back into your office or home and you need to write your report, you cannot remember what the little figures were. So rather write down right next to it what you have, what you've drawn there. Now, types of crime scenes, and remember, a crime scene or an environmental crime scene is not only just maybe an impala in a snare. There may be many other things that you can stumble upon. There's a range of situation. It can either be in the bush or the field. It can be a vehicle. You can stumble upon a vehicle for whatever reason, or however you got to it, and you may find in that vehicle something sinister or something which is prohibited. It can be a premises as well, a house, a room, a factory. It can be a pollution site where things have been dumped, which is not allowed. It can be pollution in a river. It can be air pollution. It can either be your primary or secondary scene. To give an example of a primary scene would be, for instance, a poaching scene where we would find a dead rhino. And then your secondary scene would be the scene where the arrest took place. Field rangers might have followed up on tracks that they found at the carcass, and they make an arrest later on. So that will be then your secondary scene. Just a few quick examples there of scenes. I can start at the top left, the photograph there that was taken in somebody's yard where 3 dead impala were found. The top right one, that's Boltong. This character was camping in Kruger for quite a while, targeting buffalo and kudu, and he didn't take the meat out until it was dried. and then bottom left, all those animals were shot, and so this vehicle was the crime scene where it was found, where the animals were shot. And then the bottom right one, a snare set for a specific animal. For interest's sake, this was set for a predator. You can see it's in a little enclosure, and these are also things that you can take note of, is how things are being done. There's only one entrance into that in little enclosure, and if you use your imagination, the rock there resembles a piece of meat. So this guy wanted to snare some kind of predator, whether it was a hyena or a leopard or a lion, doesn't matter. He forced it into one area. And this was in a room. This man was found with suspected game meat in his room. So your scene again isn't necessarily only in the bush. Now, initial questions that you may ask: has a crime been committed? After your initial investigation on the scene, you may realize that the crime wasn't committed, that maybe this impala was killed by a leopard, and the leopard for some reason ran away. So you must first establish whether you reckon a crime has been committed. How old is the scene? This will give you an indication of when the crime was committed. If you can, it's not always easy to establish the age of a scene, and it also depends on the time of the year, summer or winter. Things may go rotten much quicker during the summer than during winter months. The species involved, if it's possible to identify it, as I've already said, sometimes when it's too old and being eaten by scavengers, for instance, then you won't be able to identify the species. And also, remembering the photograph of the guy with the meat in his room. It was suspected game meat, so you won't be able to identify the species right away. Did suspects leave anything behind? With the emphasis on anything behind, and the anything, never think that something is too insignificant. I'll show you a photograph a bit later on something that I almost thought that was insignificant, but who actually that solved the thing for me in the end, and which gave us a conviction in court. Is the suspect still present? Think back about stop, look, and listen. Make sure that the suspect, if he is still present, that you have to deal with him as well. And are there any traces to be found on a suspect if you do find him? Any traces of, for instance, like blood, if he had worked with a carcass, or anything that you think can be from the scene that can be found on the suspect? And how many people are involved? If you can establish that, a good indicator is, if you can see any tracks on the scene, is to count different types of shoes, and that should give you an indication of how many people were involved. I just need to move something here. Guiding principles of a crime scene investigation. Now, you might have heard about the Lockhart principle, which is basically says that every contact leaves a trace. It is almost impossible for somebody not to leave any trace behind. So always keep that in mind. If you stray upon a crime scene yourself, you also leave your own contacts behind. But the Lockhart principle basically deals with that every contact leaves a trace. A criminal almost always leaves a trace of their presence. I mean, that coincides with the first bullet. Traces are exchanged when people comes into contact with the surface. Whether it's your fingers, you don't only leave fingerprints, you always also leave what we call touch DNA. If you walk around, you would leave footprints. Something always stays behind on a scene when it comes into contact with the surface. Like, for instance, footwear impressions or tracks or spurs, commonly known, fingerprints, DNA, blood stains, and fibers. Now, those are all common knowledge to you. I'm pretty sure everybody has at least once watched a program, one of these crime scene investigation programs, and these are the things that you most commonly would find. They're not always visible. Fingerprints and DNA are not visible, but you need somebody in the end to collect that for you. But what is important is that you need to be aware of those so that you do not touch on the integrity of your scene. Always remember, any contact leaves a trace, and that's something that you need to keep in your mind. As I said before, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. It did happen, but for purposes of you working with a statement or a report or questions being asked in court, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. It is essential to keep detailed and accurate notes of your findings from your initial approach to the scene until leaving the scene. I cannot emphasize this more. If you do not keep detailed, accurate notes, you are going to struggle to compile a report or a statement afterwards. Ensure that any potential crime scene stays uncontaminated. And we'll speak a bit more very quickly on contamination, but again, keep in mind the integrity of your scene. Contamination includes the following: addition to or any potential exhibit, the alterations or something to the scene. The moment you alter something on the scene or move something around on the scene, then you have contaminated that scene, and I can promise you that anything that you've moved around will not be collected by the crime scene investigator. Do not remove anything from a scene, because then you've tampered with that scene. Accidental damaging or destroyal of an exhibit. I know nobody will do it on purpose, but it happens. Definitely it happens by accident, especially if you do not see something, you may step on it. So be very careful when you move around. And then, very important, always keep in mind, again, going back to the integrity of the scene, do not leave your own traces. If you leave your own traces, you will have to give a sample to the police or the investigating officer of whatever trace you leave, so that they can actually exclude that when they do their investigation. Now, the initial search, circle the scene and search for any entrance and exit points. I know it's not always easy to see these entrance and exit points, and you are not expert trackers, but there are some indicators that can indicate to you, or you may find indicators that can indicate to you wherever people enter or exit a scene. Make notes of what you see. Again, as you walk, make notes. What we always do is we have somebody doing the notes. If you're more than one person, but if you're on your own, you must make the notes yourself. Otherwise, you can task somebody to do the notes for you. Mark the entry and exit points, and then set a perimeter and protect the scene with barrier tape, improvised markers, or with staff. You need to protect the scene, especially if there's an animal carcass, because you may find that predators are going to move into it, and then it's going to destroy the scene for you. Photograph on the perimeters from at least 4 different directions, and there's a couple of graphics following, and then report your findings per phone or per radio. Now, this is just a graphic example of how one can circle the scene. I always stay away, if I can, depending on how thick the bush is, at least 25 to 50 meters away from my carcass, and there I circle, because if somebody enters or exits there, you will definitely cross their spoor. Doesn't matter how far you are from the scene. And then take your photograph from 4 different directions. Reason being for the 4 different directions is it gives you like a 3D or a 4D picture when you go back and reconstruct your scene. Just 4 photographs from the same scene, same carcass, just 4 different directions. And you can see there's already a marker A. So this scene wasn't undisturbed. It wasn't the initial photograph, so there shouldn't have been a marker on it, but it was the most practical example I could find at the time. Do you have a mandate? You will not necessarily have a mandate. Being second-year students and not being appointed in some conservation agency where you are appointed, you probably will not have a mandate to do any further investigations. In other words, to, for instance, collect evidence. You have to be mandated in terms of legislation to collect and deal with exhibits. It may happen, and let's hope for your sake it doesn't happen that for some reason you need to collect evidence because the elements like bad weather or a fire or whatever is going to destroy an exhibit, and then you need to collect it, but that's a different lecture for a different time. If not your responsibilities, you are basically limited to securing the scene, to an initial search, to photograph the scene, and to then report your findings. So these are your limitations. Unfortunately, I think you will maybe think it will be quite interesting and nice to carry on, but as a first responder, rather stick to these four, and then you will stay, first of all, out of trouble, and then you will not contaminate your evidence any further. If the need arises or you're being instructed after a search to do a further search, except for your initial search, very important, do not touch, handle, or collect any exhibits. Search methodological, e.g. in a spiral search, a grid or a zone search or a lane search. Just walking around randomly, I found, is not really the way to search it, because you're definitely going to miss something. If you have more than one person on the scene, it makes it much more easier, and then a thing like a grid search or a lane search is more practical. And then photograph any potential exhibit that you see, with the emphasis here on potential exhibit. Do not make the decision there that it's insignificant, rather photograph it, and then you ensure that if it is of significance, somebody else will collect it later on, and you will also include it in your statement. And then always, again, be aware of potential contamination of your scene while you are busy searching it. This is an example of a zone search, where you basically would search in lanes. You would walk up and down and crisscross it. Sorry, that wasn't the zones. There's the zone search, where you divide your scene into 2 or 4 or 6 zones, with the center point there in the middle, your carcass, for instance, and then you would search each of those blocks separately. And then a spiral search, to me, is very effective if you are alone on a scene, where you can just walk in a spiral, starting in the middle or the center of your scene, and then working it outwards. Record keeping, notes again of everything you see, coordinates of the scene, or give a detailed description. Draw a rough sketch. We've covered these already, but as you walk along searching your scene, you may find more things, so you can record all of that on your sketch plan. Photograph any evidence, camera or cell phone, doesn't matter. Smartphones nowadays takes better pictures than some cameras I know of. And be as complete as you can, since your original notes can assist you when you draft your statement. And as well as I said before, it's also allowed in the court, your original note, to refresh your memory with. If you have to draft a statement a month later, then it wasn't fresh in your mind. But if you do have notes, then you can refer to your notes drafting your statement. This is also a sketch plan. It's not a rough sketch plan. What one would normally do is, when you get back to the office, you would sit down and you would draw something properly, which can be also used and filed in a docket, for instance. Types of evidence, very quickly. I see we're running out of a bit of time. Footwear impressions. Out in the environment, in the bush, there's always a footprint somewhere. So take a proper photograph of that from the top. Depending on where the sun is, you may have to take a photograph from a different direction to get a little bit of definition. Spent cartridge casings, very important. It's significant because it can be linked to the firearm. Firing pin marks, the breech block marks, and the extractor marks on that spent cartridge casing is important. It can link to the weapon. Anything else that you can find. These poachers just emptied their backpack after they've shot a rhino. They put the horns in the bag and they left. And on those bottles, there were fingerprints, there were DNA, there were touch DNA, and it's very important to collect those. A bullet. The bullet, this one was found after a post-mortem. You will not be troubled doing a post-mortem, but I found bullets lying on the ground, especially on older scenes. Also important because the striation marks on this can be linked back to the weapon itself. A piece of fiber, and a very short story. Sorry, I see the time is almost up, but I almost did not collect this piece of fiber on a poaching scene. And 2 weeks later, this bag was found in poacher's possession. And the forensic laboratory couldn't only match the color of that fiber and the type of fiber, they could actually point out exactly where it broke off from that bag. And we could put these poachers on more than one scene. So never think again that something is too insignificant. And that was basically it in a nutshell. As I said at the beginning, this is for first responders. It's not possible to make of you seasoned crime scene investigators in a 35-minute time slot, but hopefully it gives you an idea of, as I see it, what the first responder should not do on a scene and how to, if you have to do something, do it properly.
I would like to invite the students to use the opportunity to ask questions. You can use the reaction tools at the bottom, or you're welcome to put your questions in the chat. I see Cheryl's video is on. I'm not sure if she would like to ask a question or make a comment. I can see that Courage has got a question there. If a predator made the kill, leaves it behind, and somebody else, an intruder, collects it, is it not recognized as a crime? That's an interesting situation.
Yes, it's a difficult, not a difficult one. I think it also depends on the specific provincial legislation, whether it is a crime or whether it is a restricted activity to possess game meat in a sense like that. But from Kruger's perspective, yes, it definitely is, because people need to trespass onto the reserve to collect it for a start. If it's outside a reserve, I think it will depend on the specific provincial legislation whether it is a restricted activity to possess that meat.
All right, Holly Magog, I see your hand is up.
Two questions, Frik, and I'll ask the both of them and you can talk to the both. So the first off is in terms of collecting evidence, and you had that wonderful page from your notepad. How about voice, doing a voice recorder and recording everything you see? How is that presented in court, and is that something more common these days? And the second thing I'm going to talk to, because I think most of your students, Cheryl, will have come across this very famous phrase, and I wonder, Frik, if you could talk to this phrase, and I hope I get it right. The evidence of absence is not the absence of evidence. I hope that's the right way around, but it's a very famous phrase used all over the young world. So that's all.
Thanks, Holly.
Sorry, I tried to make a few notes here. First of all, about the collection of the evidence, the voice recording, I think it's a great idea. Just make sure that you do not accidentally delete it. It has happened to a colleague of mine before where he did that. Luckily, he took photographs as well. But no, it's a great idea, especially if you walk around, it's just to make a voice recording of whatever you see. I would still, after I've made my recording, go and sit down and just do a rough sketch as well, and also note it down, just for in case something goes wrong with that voice recording of yours. Now, if I got it correctly, your second questions, the evidence of absence is not necessarily the absence of evidence.
I think it's the wrong way around, Frik. I think it's supposed to be the absence of evidence, not yes. Evidence of absence.
All right, yeah. I think that's I think it refers to, and I hope I'm not wrong, is to evidence that you basically cannot see. And I think I referred to fingerprints and DNA. Is things that you do not see or cannot see on the on a scene doesn't mean that there isn't evidence. If I'm correct, then, and so much more reason to act and react on a scene in a way that you do not potentially contaminated. It's so easy to leave your own DNA on the scene. For instance, to give you a very quick example, we sometimes work on a scene in circumstances where it's like 42 degrees in the middle of the day. It is impossible not to sweat, and it's very possible and very easy to, and it may sound a bit gory, to drip your own sweat onto a piece of evidence as you are working with. But I think the absence of evidence doesn't mean, or the absence of visual evidence doesn't mean that it isn't there. Very briefly, just to add on to that, you know, an environmental crime scene is something that you need to look for evidence of. It's not your typical room with a dead body, a gun, a bullet in the wall, DNA staring or blood stains staring at you. You need to go and look for it, and especially in the bush. I've dealt with the scene before Rhino was shot. It was 2 by 4 kilometers large. And how do you find evidence there? You look for it. You will not find it if you do not look for it. If you do not point out things and find things like those plastic bottles, for instance, and emphasize it to somebody that there may be fingerprints on it, there may be DNA on it. Somebody drank from that bottle. So even if they cannot find fingerprints or DNA or touch DNA on the outside of the bottle, when you unscrew it, they may find DNA on the open side of the bottle there. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you very much. Cheryl, before I come to you, I would just like to refer to Lihani's question in the chat. How would one go about as a student to get exposure or training in this field? For those students who want to go further in this field specifically.
Well, I'm not sure about the programs that has been or that is on offer, for instance, at TUT. But what we have done in the past is we did take on people who is busy with conservation studies on to scenes when we do visit a scene. Obviously, they cannot take part in that, but as far as I know, there are no formal training as far as I know with any formal institutions, but there are many people who present crime scene training. I can go through the effort and I can supply you with contact numbers of people who supply crime scene training, whether it's basic, whether it's advanced, and you can sign up with those people and they can take you onto their program. It's mostly private individuals whom I know speaks from authority and experience, seasoned people who have maybe retired, but I will see to it that I supply some contact details to Johan so that it can be made available to you.
Thank you very much. Cheryl, please ask your question.
Hi, thanks again, Rick, for doing everything that you have done this morning for my students. When you do go out to a crime scene, do you go every time with the same team? Like you go with, for instance, yourself and the same number 1, 2, and 3. Do you get is your team also tested? That means they've got to wear the same boots, they've got to wear gloves and stuff like that. So your team that you go out with, is it the same people? And have they been trained by Sanparks, for instance, and there's certain things which they have to do before they can go out?
Yes, we are very privileged in that we have a team within our department, our crime scene investigation team. We used to be 4 people, currently there are only 2 because the good news is that rhino poaching has decreased seriously, and dealing only with rhino poaching issues, the only serious poaching stuff in Kruger, it's declined. But yes, it's the same team every time. We're also very privileged in that we have our own stock theft unit from the police in Skukuza. Their offices are right next to ours. So every time a detective will go to a scene, a forensic policeman will go to the scene to collect all the evidence that we find, and then 2 team members from the crime scene team. They are all equipped with, well, first of all, they are all well trained from conducting a proper post-mortem. They all had proper training there, formal training, the collection of samples for DNA, and then also general crime scene conduct. They are equipped each with its own crime scene bag or kit, which has all kinds of paraphernalia, but basic, not too much, not too many, and which they use on the scene to mark evidence, for instance, to cordon off. Yes, gloves is very important, but I found colleagues who fell not into the trap, but it was an honest mistake. Do not carry gloves in your pockets all the time, because remember, the moment you touch those gloves, you put it in your pocket, you're leaving your own DNA on it. So if you do not have access to fresh, uncontaminated gloves in a box, for instance, then do not carry something with you that you take in and out of your pocket every day, just for instance, that you may need it by chance. But yes, we have a dedicated team, and they do also have a specific uniform, and we also have PPE kits, personal protective kits if necessary. But as I said before, in our environment, it gets very warm and hot, and those PPE suits are not user-friendly in our environment. So what we would do is the guys would take their own gumboots from a scene, they would decontaminate it. All their equipment, like knives and stuff, is decontaminated after the investigation. If you need to do more than one scene, more than one carcass, you have to do or decontaminate your equipment on the first scene before moving on to the next one. So we also take water and bleach, for instance, with, and soap to decontaminate our kit with. Does it answer your question?
Thanks, Cheryl. Cheryl, would you like to comment further, or are you happy?
No, it's great knowing that. I didn't even think about the gloves in your pocket. Thank you. Many years back, I worked for GDOD, and I was linked to not just environmental education, which I did for many years, but I also helped Jacques out many years back, and we did a lot of crime scenes, and we did a lot of lookout posts and everything. And yes, things have progressed over the years. And yeah, thank you very much. And I really hope that a lot of my students do go into this field, because it's crucial. We've got to try and stamp this out. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O. So there's a question from Gina in the chat. It's a very practical question. How do you deal with the situation during rainy periods? In a case where it is obvious that an animal was poached, do you just ignore all the process, or would you still want to push? Because I think rain can be a good destroyer of evidence, especially DNA and footprints.
Thank you. It's a very, very good question. As Cheryl just said, things have progressed over the years, and some of the equipment that you do take to a scene doesn't like rain. But no, we cannot leave a scene until it stops raining, because very, very correct, you are going to lose out on evidence. You are going to lose out on fingerprints. DNA may be destroyed and washed away, and things like footprints as well. So if it hasn't been destroyed already, we will not, unless it's really pouring rain and you cannot get into an area. For instance sake, because Kruger is such a vast area, it's 2 million hectares, and some of our scenes are, you may attend to more than one per day. So we tow a little vehicle called a John Deere Gator to the closest point of the scene, and then we drive to it there. And when it's too wet to travel onto management roads, obviously you won't be able to attend to it. But no, we don't let rain put us off. The longer you wait, the more you lose. So we would like to attend to it as quickly as possible, regardless of the weather conditions.
Right, thank you very much. Then another practical question from John Honeyball. Good day, sir. What steps do you follow when a foreigner poaches inside your reserve?
Well, we have quite a few foreigners, without mentioning specific nationalities, that strays into Kruger. Normally they would jump the fence and walk in. If a foreigner is not in possession of documents which legalized him in the country for a start, then he is an illegal immigrant, but he has trespassed. So once the police has processed them, then one of the charges will also be that of undocumented migrant or an illegal immigrant. There's also the bail process, but that is up to court. So what we will do is we would try and present evidence in court during the bail application to try and prohibit this person of, being granted bail, so that we can ensure that he attends at least the next court hearing. But it is difficult. If somebody enters the country, for instance, and he's entered legally with the passport can be taken from him. So one of the bail conditions may be that he can hand in his passport as a bail condition, which will allow him to stay in the country. But one don't want to take anybody's freedom away just as easy as that. So, bail conditions for foreigners is a little bit difficult in the sense of if they're legally in the country, it may not be that easy to limit their movement. I don't know if it answers your question, but we have people jumping the fence and luckily they trespass. So it's immediately an arrest for trespass.
Thank you very much. Holly, you're welcome to ask your question.
This is just something that came into my mind because I was listening to a podcast the other day about introduction of non-native species. Is that an environmental crime? And has that been something you've ever come across of someone like releasing their pet something into the park and you found this? How do you prosecute that?
Yeah, well, it's a difficult one for me in the sense of we haven't really had incidents like those in Kruger, but I know our colleagues in the provincial reserves do. So I'm not an authority or an expert on it, and I would hate to give you the wrong information there. I've really not come upon it, except for somebody who tried to smuggle a dog or a cat into the park in his vehicle. For us, that's easy. It gets seized, and the person gets asked to leave the park. Or the dog or the cat gets quarantined until they leave. But the introduction of something like that, unfortunately, I'm not an authority on that one.
Thanks, Holly. Interesting question. It seems to be cold this morning in Kenya. I don't see any further questions at the moment. I know, Lihani van der Walt, that you would like to say something. So if I can please ask Maret to unmute you.
Thanks, everyone. I would just like, on behalf of the second year students from TT, to thank Mr. Rossouw for sharing his time and knowledge in the procedures followed in crime scene processing. It was very interesting and insightful to see this sort of avenue in nature conservation as well. If you have more of an inclination to law and crime and stuff like that. So thank you so much. It's really, really appreciate your time and your effort. Thank you.
It's only a pleasure. And as I said, one would like to share much more with you, but I think under the circumstances and your level of studies at this stage, one unfortunately have to stick to the basics. Would have been very nice to have had you right here on the ground and take and do the real McCoy, but no, it's only a pleasure.
Cheryl, would you like to comment?
Yeah, Frick, if I may ask, every March we take our second year students on a low-fart excursion and we spend the last week virtually in Kruger. Is there any chance that maybe next year we can actually invite you to actually give the same kind of presentation and do a mock scene where the students can actually go out and collect and do DNA and everything like that? Can we do kind of a practical? Is there a possibility of that?
Yes, of course, there's a very, very big possibility. I won't be able to take them to a real scene, but no, we've done this many a times before in training that we've produced. And if you don't have my number, I will we'll give it to you. It's very
Thank
much
you.
possible. We would love to support you there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. I see there's a question from Innocent. Innocent, please go ahead.
Morning, everyone. Mr. Rossouw, thank you for the presentation. Excuse the background noise. I'm just currently driving. I just wanted to add something regarding where can the students receive training on the presentation that you gave today about crime scene investigation. I know Andre Bueta gives training on poison scene and response, and part of his training, at the end of the training, he then gives a little practical on how to collect evidence on a crime scene. So Dr. Ogilvy, I think if you can get a hold of Andre, and Andre can probably come through to TUT and give a presentation on wildlife poisoning. And at the end of the training, then he also does a practical. That'll be good for the students to at least get a practical on how to investigate a crime. Yeah, that's what I want to add.
Thanks, Innocent. Appreciate it. I think we've got the website in the chat already from Tim Snow. Thank you very much, Tim. We will look into that and reach out to them. Thank you, Innocent. If there are no further questions, Frik, thank you very, very much for a very comprehensive introduction. It is still an introduction, but it was very comprehensive. We really appreciate your time and effort, and it's really decades of experience that you shared with the students this morning. Very, very valuable. We really appreciate the effort that you made in preparing this.
No, it was only a pleasure, and yeah, I'm privileged to be involved. Sorry for the few glitches in the beginning there.
Rick, thank you once again very much for what you've done this morning. You've opened my students' eyes, because we all just say crime scene. They just walk in, they'll take photographs and maybe take a few notes, but did they really know what to do and what notes are needed? And even those little sketches, those basic sketches, and how crucial DNA is. I remember when I was still a student, I went out and did a very basic crime scene on the reserve. And I think I left my DNA all over, including my footprints, because I had no training. I was stomping all over, you know, and those days we didn't have the training. So yeah, thank you. I've learned a lot this morning myself, and yeah, it's just exposure. And you did that this morning. Thank you very much.
Just a comment. I think our general manager that we report to, Dr. Nicholas Funda, was attached to TUT, and he's a phone call away. And I know he will definitely support an initiative when you do come here. He will definitely support us supporting you there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. He spoke earlier in the series, and he somehow his presentation became a runaway hit on YouTube. I think it had something like 8,000 views. He called me one day and he said, "What's going on?" So we were very happy to welcome him as well. We'll definitely collaborate in the future as well. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for a wonderful morning together of learning, and we hope to see you next week.